I think we're ready to go. Let's get started. My name is Mel Lehman. I'm the Director of Common Humanity. And behind me, you can see some of the art that we work with. Common Humanity is a peacemaking organization which helps Americans to see a broader and fuller picture of the rest of the world. We see one narrow part of it often when our troops are overseas, but we don't really hear too much about the world in general when we're not, our vital interests are not involved. So we try to help people see more about the world, and we found that art is a very unusual way. So behind me is an Amish quilt, which is part of my American Amish Mennonite heritage. And I personally tried to join that with these pictures, which are from the Middle East. Today, we're traveling a little further in the East, all the way to Korea. And we have on our screen a distinguished guest. His name is Doug Hostetter. I will let Doug introduce himself in the course of his comments, except to say, by way of full disclosure, that Doug is a personal friend of mine and a personal friend of my older brother, Glenn, who we all went to college together, what was Eastern Mennonite University. So without further ado, let me introduce a distinguished peace worker of many years and a personal friend. Welcome to the Peace Channel, Doug, and we're eager to hear what you have to say.
Okay, just by way of introduction, I will mention that for about a dozen years, I was the Mennonite Central Committee Director of the United Nations office in New York. It was in that role that I was invited to travel to North Korea to visit some of the humanitarian projects that the Mennonite Central Committee was doing in North Korea. I am currently the Pax Christi International, part of the UN advocacy team, and I cover Israel, Palestine, North Korea, Iran, and nuclear issues at the UN. And part of my work historically with countries with which my nation considers that they are the enemy is to develop personal relations with some of the diplomats in New York. And we'll probably put off that conversation to a later meeting. But because so few Americans have traveled to North Korea, and probably only several dozen in the last 60 years since the end of the Korean War, so Americans know very little about North Korea. And I want to do a bit of a historical background, just so that you know a bit about North Korea, because most Americans have been taught nothing about North Korea. Perhaps I'll start with the fact that it's a 5,000-year-old civilization. Its language, its culture, its arts, its pottery goes back 5,000 years. And it's located to the south of China, to the southwest of Japan. It would be north of Vietnam and Malaysia and the Southeast Asia countries, but so it's the other thing that most Americans are unaware of is that the United States approved Japan coming in and colonizing Korea in 1910. This was negotiated with our State Department and our president, who were cozying up to Japan against both China and Korea. And Japan occupied parts of China, committed horrendous atrocities there, occupied Korea from 1910 until the end of World War II, when Japan was defeated. And then rather than allowing Korea to become an independent nation, the way in which the United States had kind of said we were going to try to do with the colonies after World War II. We would encourage them, all of the African, Latin American, Caribbean colonies, encourage them towards independence. We did the same thing with Korea that we did with Germany and also with Japan. We reached an agreement with Russia, with no Koreans actually involved in the discussion at all, that they would divide it into two zones. There would be a northern zone that would be occupied by the Soviet Union, and the southern zone, which would be occupied by the US and the Allies. There were many atrocities that happened in the South. There was mass migrations of people trying to get from one area to the other. As many of us are Christians, I'll give a little bit of a historical context that's really interesting about Korea. Korea was not colonized by a Christian colonial power. China was, Vietnam was, Burma, Thailand, well, Thailand wasn't quite, but Malaysia, Indonesia, all of them were colonized by Western Christian nations. And actually, Korea was colonized by Japan, which was a Buddhist and Shinto religion. And one of the interesting, unique things about Korea is that many of the early Christian pastors joined with the communists in the struggle against the colonial power, Japan. This was kind of in the pre-World War II period or during World War II. Kim Il-sung, the founding leader of North Korea, was mentored by a Chinese Christian pastor who was engaged in the struggle. So it is interesting in that there is a Korean Christian Federation, which most Americans have never heard of, because you couldn't have Christianity in North Korea. We are taught that, it persecutes all Christians. Actually, the head of the Korean Christian Federation, until about 6 years ago, was a childhood friend of Kim Il-sung, kind of the Washington of Korea. So it is true that in South Korea, there are many evangelical and other Christians who have combined Christianity with US and Western capitalism and nationalism and has tried to subvert North Korea. But there are indigenous North Korean Christians that live and worship in North Korea. So that is a bit of the background. I'm trying to think if there are any other, well, so actually, the United States has been at war with Korea since the Korean War, actually, since World War II, when Kim Il-sung tried to establish the independence of all of Korea. He did not want Korea divided between the Soviet Union and the United States as occupied territories, but he had been engaged in the struggle and wanted to have an independent Korean government. The United States has threatened North Korea many, many times. We have, usually we do at least 2 major military operations. They are joint operations with the South Korean military and the US military, often involving 300,000 troops, nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, nuclear power submarines, nuclear powered or nuclear capable B-2 bombers and B-52 bombers. So twice a year, every year, the US and South Korea have been doing these military things. And North Korea has thought that these are basically practiced for an invasion and for an overthrow. Probably the thing that surprised me the most in my trip to North Korea was how frightened the North Koreans were that America would attack and occupy North Korea. The other thing most Americans don't know about is what we did to North Korea during the Korean War. It was an incredibly bloody war. We ended up destroying every single industrial city in North Korea. Before the Korean War, the industry in Korea was in the north. That's a mountainous area, has lots of minerals, very rich in iron ore and coal and all the things that you need for a good industrial base. The South actually has these huge deltas, wonderful grasslands, and before the Korean War, the North was the industrial capital of Korea, and the South was the agricultural capital. Interestingly enough, the North was also the Christian center in the North. Presbyterians and Methodists, even during the Japanese occupation of Korea, had established Christian schools in North Korea. It would have been under Japan. And actually, just an interesting tidbit, some of you may have noticed that Billy Graham, probably maybe a dozen years ago, was invited to travel to North Korea. And people were surprised. Why would North Korea invite Billy Graham to come to North Korea? Well, it turns out that Ruth Graham, his wife, went to high school in Pyongyang, in the capital of North Korea, in a Presbyterian high school. She probably was a classmate of most of, because the church schools were actually the best, she was probably a classmate of most of the leaders in North Korea today. They were both brought there, welcomed, treated as guests. I was blown away. I'd never known about this. Somehow or other it didn't get covered in the American media very well. But we went into a large kind of concert hall, reception hall kind of thing. And I looked up and there was a picture of Billy Graham shaking hands with Kim Il-sung. I said, what's going on? And they explained, she's one of us. She went to high school here in Pyongyang and knew many of our leaders back in those days. Several times when I was traveling in North Korea, there seemed to be things that were completely unexplainable to me. One place we were kind of driving up through a hilly mountainous area, and there were two large brick pillars on either side of the road. It looked like an ancient temple, but actually I knew there were no ancient temples. Everything had been bombed to the ground in the north during the Korean War. The pilots complained there were no more targets. They were just juggling the bricks around because all of the cities had been destroyed. And by the end of the war, Koreans who survived were all living underground. So anyhow, so I realized, this couldn't be part of an ancient temple. And so I asked the MCC staff who was stationed in Asia, and I said, what is this? And she said, oh, this is for defensive purposes. When the Americans invade and the tanks and armored personnel carriers try to come up into the hills here, the people in the surrounding villages will push over those towers, and there's no other way for them to get through this pass. It's the only way to get through. I was also traveling down, before I went, American scholars that I met with said, you're going to be totally kept in Pyongyang, the capital. They won't allow Americans outside of the capital. However, I was there representing the Mennonite Central Committee, and at that point, the Mennonite Central Committee had 13 different orphanages all over North Korea. And we visited almost every one. So I went to the north, I went to the East Coast, I went to the West Coast, I went down towards the DMZ. And I'll never forget, we were driving down towards the DMZ, and there were like 3 or 4 of us in the MCC delegation, and a couple of minders and guides to make sure that we got to the right place and didn't take pictures that we weren't supposed to. So there were about a half a dozen of us in this very small van. We were driving down a huge highway. It was at least 6 lanes, 3 on each side, no median in the middle. The lanes were absolutely clean. They had been swept off, no leaves, no nothing. And actually, there was a little macadam path on the side for people who were on bicycles or walking. So there were no pedestrians, no bicycles, and a 6-lane highway. And I looked in front of our van, front window of the van as far as I could see, looked at the back window of our van as far as I could see, and there was nothing there. And so once again, I turned to my colleague and I said, you know, why would you have a 6-lane highway here down close to the DMZ and there's no traffic? And the traffic that there is pedestrian traffic, and they're on a little macadam thing on the side, and yet everything was swept clean. And she said, well, they know that when the Americans attack, they will destroy the airports, and the airplanes will have no place to land. And we will use our highways for them to land after they've destroyed the airports. And so if you look carefully, there were places along the highways where I'm sure they could pull off and service planes after the airports were destroyed. So this is real. They believe it at the bottom of their heart. And actually, I tried to talk to them. I said, you know, I work around the UN. China is never going to allow this to happen. Don't worry, America is just blustering. They are not going to attack you. Relax. I could never convince any North Korean that they were not in imminent danger of being attacked at any time. So they are also one of the tightest societies that I've ever visited. The CIA has been trying to find out what's going on in North Korea for many decades. They know nothing. They know nothing about North Korea. And the reason why they know nothing is because they have a very tightly controlled society, a society that monitors everything. When guests come in, and the Mennonite Central Committee had been working there for by that point, it was maybe 10, 12 years already. And we were welcomed and were doing things that they really appreciated. But this was 10 years ago. I think they've loosened up some, but no cell phones, no laptops. We were warned, if you're bringing in reading material, don't bring in a Newsweek, bring in a romantic novel, something that could not be misconstrued politically or for sabotage or dishonoring the supreme leader or anything like that. As a photographer, I can say it's the most difficult country that I've ever taken photos in. We had minders who were with us, and you had to ask for permission for every photograph that you took. And then actually on the way out to the airport, on the way out, my minder kind of leaned over and said, I'd like to see your camera. And I said, sure. So he went and scrolled through every picture I had taken to make sure that I hadn't secretly snuck off and taken some photo that would either be insulting to the Koreans like this. I will tell you, I tried I tried to get humanized, ordinary people. So I was not allowed to take pictures of children walking home to a rural school very close to one of the orphanages that we were working. Because it was an MCC orphanage, I could take pictures inside the orphanage or to any official meeting that I took place or any poster, monument, or whatever, but I couldn't take pictures on the sidewalk in front of the hotel where we stayed. You know, they wanted to be very careful. And I must say that partly it's because they're afraid and they do not want the Americans or the CIA, they want them to know as little about their country as possible. So you will be seeing photos that very few people have seen. And the only reason why I was able to go and take these photos is because the Mennonite Central Committee was doing work that they valued. They welcomed us as guests. They wanted us to take pictures in the orphanages and the milk factory that we had helped them establish, a soy milk factory, because they knew we had to take pictures to be able to go back to our donors and say, the contributions that you give to the Mennonite Central Committee for North Korea are actually being used. So anyhow, I think without further ado, I will, or did you want to get a question, Mel?
Let's take a look at some of the pictures of the orphanages. I'm intrigued by, well, whatever pictures you have available to start out.
Yeah, we'll,
through the pictures.
We will start with, actually, I'll start with the full set. Okay, this is the this is the airport, and I'm trying to stop it so that I can go.
I think you got it. I think that's it.
Yeah, I think I've got it now. It's Pyongyang is a major city, and this was 10 years ago. If you went back today, you would find a much more developed city. And it's interesting, despite all of the sanctions, the capital city has continued to grow with substantial buildings all through the sanctions. This was from the top of one of the monuments looking down on some of the bridges that are in the capital city. Early morning. This is actually the concert hall, the opera hall.
Oh, very beautiful.
Yeah. These are people going to work in the morning, going down to get on the subway or to get on and use an underpass that would go under a major intersection there. Very busy in the morning. I was actually looking out my hotel window that I was able to take that. Lots of bicycles, the mix of traffic, heavy, this was 10 years ago. I'm sure it's changed somewhat now, but heavy on bicycles and then a few military trucks and then kind of fancy diplomatic cars. So they're big on monuments. This is a celebration of agriculture and industry. And it's in one of the beautiful parks there in the capital. 3 generations, maybe 4 generations there, very strong support of the family. This is Juche. This is the primary symbol of North Korea, which is self-reliance. And it's interesting. They have what would come from the Soviets. You've got the hammer and the sickle, the industry and agriculture. But I find very interesting, they also have the writer's quill, the paintbrush of the scholar and the writer. So they are saying, unlike the Soviet Union, we recognize our scholars and our writers, as well as our industrial workers and agricultural workers. Now, when I was there, it was during the period of Kim Jong-il. He is on the left there. Kim Il-sung is on the right. Kim Il-sung would be the grandfather of the current president. Kim Jong-il would be the father of the current president. Kim Il-sung would be the equivalent of Ho Chi Minh or George Washington. He was very active in leading the struggle against Japanese occupation. They have many, many murals celebrating the people. This was, once again, you know, there was no problem taking any pictures of murals. This was probably Kim Il-sung in his youth, I believe, reading a book, but also, you know, he's got his sickle there beside him. So he was out harvesting the rice and paused to probably read some poetry. This, I think, is Kim Jong-il, the man who was the president when I was there. So these are all over, and I did not. This would be another picture of Kim Jong-il, and in the background is a huge industrial project which they did to fence off this whole inlet to when the water goes out, they are then able to use it to generate electricity. So they're, you know, it's a huge industrial thing. You can see how much of a bay they had to enclose in order to do this. Classical music is, as well as Korean music, are very big. You know, and this would have been a mixture, I think, of both Western and Korean instruments being played at a major concert. Just a little diversion. When I was at this concert, I told you that security is really, really tight. 3 days earlier, we were invited to go to a big march in the huge plaza in the center of the Capitol. And Kim Jong-il was going to be there. And we didn't know it at the time, but Kim Jong-un, for the first time he was presented, was also going to be there. So we were told, unfortunately, you can't bring your camera, you can't bring, you know, anything else, just come. What they had forgot to tell us was that we were not allowed to bring a ballpoint pen and a notebook to take notes. Security was so tight. So we went through like 3 levels of security because we were put into a foreign section of this thing, probably 20 yards from the supreme leader. When we got to the last one, they noticed I had a pen in my pocket, and they said, "I'm really sorry, but you cannot take this pen into the plaza." And I said, "That's fine, no problem." I was sure I had another one somewhere back in my luggage. So 3 days later, when I was sitting in this concert, there was a bustle at the end of the row. And the guy that we were, my guide, turned and said something to him. And then the guy that was at the end of the road handed my guide the pen that had been taken from me 3 days earlier. And we said, "We're very sorry we had to take this from you. Here's your pen back." So that gives you an idea of how tight the security is in North Korea. I was fortunate to be there doing Ariane. Ariane is a huge, it's called a, it's not quite a dance. It's not quite acrobats. It is, they call it mass games. There are literally 100,000 participants in these mass games. Now there's maybe 20,000 there on the field, maybe 40 or 50. The other 50, 60,000 are up in the stands, and they are holding up colored placards that make those roses and the whatever it says in Korean and the flowers. That is all made by synchronized. Here, they changed it. This is the North Korean flag. So it is amazing. I'll play just a very short clip so you get an idea of what this actually is like.
Wow, amazing, amazing.
Sorry. Okay.
That was great.
Okay, so I think I jumped onto this is a library at the university. For the elite that attends the university, they really are given absolutely the top materials. You wonder why Korea was able to develop a nuclear weapon in a relatively short time, and Iran never did. Some of it may be because Iran never wanted to, and Korea did. We may never know, but we do know that Koreans are very brilliant. It's a small elite, but they study very hard. They have excellent libraries, and this is a group of students there in the university going to class. This is one of the lecture halls. I offered to, it was an English lecture. I offered to speak to the class. They actually declined, but we were able to take pictures. This is a marriage. The woman in red is the bride, and the man to her left is the groom. I think that's probably her mother in pink and her father on the other side. They were at our hotel in the capital, and we're coming there for a reception or something. And I asked whether it would be possible for me to take a picture, and they readily said yes. These are just ordinary people. Now, this is in the capital, so I'm sure this kind of thing does not happen in the rural villages. The pictures that I was not allowed to take of kids coming home from school didn't look quite like this. So these would be children of the elite. But it's, you know, this is actually in the plaza right in front of the opera hall that was across the street from the hotel that we were in. And so I was given permission to take pictures of these kids. This is another kid who was just playing on one of the statues there. This is a picture of a farm truck going to the rural areas, and that picture I was only able to take because the plane was on the way out, and I was able to get it through the window, as was true of this picture of the men working in the field just outside the runway, just off the end of the runway. But it is a beautiful country. These are actually salt flats, I think, actually towards the eastern coast where we were. People bring in seawater and allow it to dry. Here's our, these would be fishermen out fishing. These would be the kind of people that I wasn't able to get up close to. So this is a mural in one of the orphanages that we visited. MCC at that point was supporting 13 different orphanages. They are now supporting 3 different pediatric hospitals. So anybody who is interested in helping North Korean children, MCC is still continuing that work. And I'm sorry, my Korean language skills can't give you a translation on that. This is, let's see, Kathy Suderman is she was the MCC Northeast Asia staff who was traveling with us. And this would be the head of the orphanage, and then these would be the various caretakers and the children. This would have been, I don't know, maybe we went to everything from infants to 5-year-olds in orphanages. Now, let me explain a little bit about orphanages in Korea. Korea is a very poor country, and in rural areas, people are very much living on the edge. So if you are a husband and your wife dies in childbirth and the child survives, you will not be able to take care of that child by yourself. So that child will go to an orphanage, and the government will take care of it. And actually, they try to give them actually absolutely the best. Although we discovered there was malnutrition, and that was one of the things we were working on very much in MCC's work there, was to increase the body weight and the nutrition for children. The other interesting thing I learned is that if you have twins and both survive, a family in North Korea can raise 2 children at once. It's a struggle, but it can be done. If you have triplets, it is understood that you can't handle triplets, and so triplets go to the state to be raised by the state. Okay, this is in a kindergarten orphanage. These children would be about 5 years old, and this was shot with just a little camera. I'll give you a little bit. Okay, I think we've.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you for reminding us of the humanity of these good people. And we don't see that at all in our media. So thank you. This is great. Keep going. Yeah, that's great.
Okay, this is one of the caretakers at the orphanage, at one of the orphanages. And once again, you know, I couldn't take a picture of a young woman on the street, even if I had her permission. But in an orphanage, I asked permission, and they were always pleased because they felt like they were doing good work, and they wanted MCC and Americans to know about that. These are some of the children. I have a weakness for kids.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful, beautiful.
This is one of the things that MCC did, was to establish gardens in the orphanages. They did not have gardens, And so we organize gardens for them to grow vegetables and fruit to supplement the work that they're doing. This is actually a rural photo drying wheat or rice, actually, on the outside of a small factory that we were visiting. This would be rural housing, but rural housing for a semi-elite who's working in one of the factories that we were visiting. This was in a soy milk factory that MCC built and supplied with soybean. And this factory would turn the soybeans into soy milk, and then soy milk would then go to the orphanages to supplement the nutritional level. They are looking at a Polaroid picture of themselves. When I travel to countries where I'm not working, and I know I'm going to be there for a short period of time, I always take a Polaroid camera because I recognize that most photography by most people is exploitative. You in the wealthy West are taking pictures of people in the East or the South or other places, and you are taking them back for your fulfillment, for your aesthetic reasons. And people will often be kind and generous and allow you to take pictures. But if you have a Polaroid and you give them a photo, it immediately changes the relationship. So it was interesting, you know, the picture that I had taken right before, they were all standing very formally. This picture was them all getting excited about their image in a Polaroid photo. This is one of the factories there. Don't know whether this is our soy milk factory. Just some more people. It is so important for Americans to know that Koreans are people, just like you and I. They want exactly the same things for their children that you want for your children. They care about health. They care about education. They care about having a job. They care about dignity and respect. The Koreans that I met actually wanted to be friends with Americans. Lots of Americans said, aren't you afraid to travel to North Korea? The Mennonite Central Committee has worked there for more than 20 years. We have never had any trouble with any of our people that are traveling there. We have been welcomed, we have treated well, and welcomed every time that we come. Now this is, I'll close with this slide, which is a monument dedicated to reunification. And you'll see a North Korean woman and a South Korean woman reaching across the highway, and the map of all of Korea is up above. Thank you.
That is so wonderful, Doug. Let's see if we have time for a couple of questions. We are pushing towards the hour, but not quite there yet. Wonderful photos. My first instinct was the name of our organization, The Common Humanity of These People, which is precisely what we're trying to do. These are people, you know? And we don't see that in our images. We see threatening images. We see aliens and differences and strangeness, and we don't see the fact that they're people just like us. I guess that's, I don't know where there's a question there, but that's the simple comment that that I would have. Let's see if there's any comments or questions that come in there on our Q&A. If you're watching, we'll take 1 or 2 more minutes there at the bottom of your screen. You'll see a Q&A, and I see a good hello from a gentleman named Mats, who says, very nice presentation. Thank you for your encouraging words, Mats. Let's see if any other questions come in. Elizabeth says, what ideas do you have for Americans to share this information? Might I jump in, Doug? I would like your comments in a moment, but might I jump in? In a minute, I'm going to go to my own screen share, which will tell you about our website, commonhumanity.org. And this, what you just saw, will be posted there. It's called our Peace Channel. And we also, if you go there, I'll show you a beautiful painting, which you can see. Last week, we had an artist from Iraq and Syrian Iraqi artist. You can see the humanity of her work in that interview. Next week, we're going to be having an Iraqi artist interviewed again. We're also going to be posting this on Facebook and on YouTube. But let me stop, and Doug, how might you answer that? What ideas do you have for Americans to share this kind of information?
Well, the Mennonite Central Committee has tried to share information about the work that they are doing in North Korea on the MCC website. I'm no longer working for MCC, but I am continuing to write and talk. I did an article for the Mennonite, probably almost a year ago, called Loving the Enemy, or Learning to Love the Enemy, or something. And it was about my work with North Korea. And let me tell you a quick anecdote that symbolizes the importance of this work. One of the diplomats that I knew quite well, in fact, I had invited him to my home for a picnic, and a number of them had come. And he was gone from New York, went back to North Korea. I hadn't seen him for probably 3 years. And suddenly I got a call. And he said he was in New York. He was across the street in the UN. And he was traveling with the foreign minister, who was about to give a presentation at the opening of the General Assembly. And he said, my wife sent you some presents. So I quickly grabbed some presents of my own and ran across to meet him in one of the lounges there. And we exchanged presents, and it was really nice. He said his wife, he was sorry that she couldn't come along. She remembered my wife and picnicking at our house and all of that. And then he said, do you remember that photograph of you and your wife and me and my wife in front of your house at that first picnic? And I said, yes, I remember it really well. Actually, I wanted to publish it in Mennonite Publications, and you wouldn't let me because you said it was a private meeting. And he said, but he did want the photograph. And he said, I took that photo home. And he said, it's on the wall of my apartment in Pyongyang. And he said, none of my Korean friends can believe that I have an American friend. And I had to tell him, actually, none of my American friends can believe that I have a North Korean friend. But that's probably some of the most significant work that I have done around the UN, is building those kind of relationships. It still boggles my mind to think that there's a photograph of me and my wife and he and his wife on the wall of his apartment in the Capitol. Now, maybe it's been taken down in the last few months. I don't know.
Let's try one more question. Edward M. writes, do you know if there is any relationship between the church in the North and any denomination or church in the South? Very good question. Very interesting question.
Yeah, actually, I could talk a whole lot more about that, but most of the North Korean Christians, I think, were Presbyterians. And I think the leadership of the Korean Christian Federation, well, actually, the Korean Christian Federation is both Catholic and Protestant. Most of the Protestants, I think, are Presbyterians. There's probably a few Methodists in there, but because there was a big Presbyterian school, a lot of them are there. And I have, here's another little anecdote I'll tell you. I went to a meeting about peace in North Korea a couple of years ago, and there was a plan to do a peace train to go from Germany through Russia, through China, and end up in North Korea. And then they were hoping maybe even go to South Korea. And this was going to be a peace train. And it was the year that the World Council of Churches was having its annual meeting, or its meeting in Busan, a major city in South Korea. So I saw this at this conference. I said, this is fabulous. You know, all these Christians from all over the world will be getting on this train in Germany. And while they're in Germany, they'll have peace seminars in German from the German Council churches, and in Russia from the Russian Council churches, and China Council churches. Then they'll go to North Korea and meet with the North Korean Christian Federation, go to South Korea to the World Council of Churches. And I said, this is really amazing. I said, have you discussed this with the North Korean government? And this pastor got a really sheepish look on his face. And he said, actually, no, we haven't. We used to have regular meetings with them. The only way that we could communicate with them was through fax. We would fax from South Korea to a fax in North Korea, and then they would fax back. But for whatever reason, that fax no longer works. And I said, well, you know, I think it's not going to be a good idea to have a trainload of Christians showing up on the North Korean border and nobody's been given advance notice. And I said, you know, I meet with North Koreans all the time. If you came to New York, I might be able to, I don't know, but I could try to set up a meeting for you with North Korean diplomats. And he said, well, we have to go back to Japan and to South Korea and discuss it with a council of churches. And they went back and they said, yeah, all right, we're coming. So they gave me a date, you know, about a month or so in advance, because I told them they probably would have to get permission, even from the capital, to do it. And I emailed to my best contact in the mission, and I said, you know, the South Korean Council of Churches is coming, and they need to meet with you because they're planning this peace train. And I'd given him some information on the peace train. I said, I've met these pastors. These are really good people. You really should work with them. So actually, I got no answer. So I wrote a second and a third time, still no answer. So I wrote back and I said, you know, I'm really sorry. Usually when it's about MCC business, they get right back to me. When I asked for a meeting for you all, they haven't gotten any response. And they said, well, we're coming to New York. We have to come to the US. We'll go to Washington first, and then we'll come to New York. So I said, all right. So they went to Washington, and so I emailed again, and I said, look, this is really, these people have traveled halfway around the world, and they want to meet with you. Radio silence, nothing at all. And the Council of Churches said, well, we know Korean Christians in New York. We're coming to New York anyhow. So I emailed in the middle of the night to my best friend in the mission. I said, look, you have to help me. You and I get together whenever we want. We meet in the UN, we meet in your office, we meet in my office. It's not a problem. Here are Christians who are trying to work for peace from the South. They have traveled halfway around the world. You have to help me meet with them. So in the middle of the night, he writes me back and he says, all right, this is the person that you have to send it to. Here's his cell phone. You may not tell him that I told you to do this. And I sent it to him, and the guy said yes, and the meeting took place. And it was amazing. And they found out that what happened was the head of the Christian Federation in North Korea had died. He's the one who had been a boyhood friend of Kim Il-sung. And he had died, and they knew in the mission, they said, yeah, we heard that he had died. I'm sure they've replaced him with somebody, but I don't know what his fax number is. So I said, but we'll work on it. So within a week, they had the new communications. Within 2 weeks, they had arranged to meet together in China. And in a month, they were meeting together to plan strategy for the Busan conference in China. So there are links between the Christian Federation in the North and the National Council of Churches in the South. It is awkward, and I think it only happens by fax. But they do have, and they sometimes have been able to meet in North Korea. South Koreans often are prohibited by their government from traveling to North Korea, or by the United States or others. And when that happens, the North Koreans go to China and the South Koreans go to China, and they meet there and they plan their common strategy for kind of the work that they're going to do in the World Council of Churches.
This has been great, Doug. I am looking at the old proverbial clock on the wall, and